Hi, you're listening to the Apologist Bookshelf. I'm Gary Zacharias. I appreciate you joining me today. There's a book by Philip Sampson, not Samson like in the Bible, Sampson, called Six Modern Myths About Christianity and Western Civilization. It's subtitled, well, in the back, it says Six Ideas Everyone Believes That Really Aren't True. And so I've done two other podcasts on this. I want to look at chapter 1, called Galileo, A Story of a Hero of Science. And what we get there is this idea that there's this monstrous clash between religion, in this case Christianity, and science, and that Christianity has tried to frustrate the advance of science over the years. So where do we see that? Well, it's been around for quite a while. He starts his story here with Bertrand Russell. And Russell claims that the modern period began with the Renaissance, and what that was doing at that time was to free men's minds from superstition and religion and to establish reason. That would be the foundation for science. But that freedom was opposed strongly by the church, and it culminated in a clash between religion and science. And guess who's on science's side? Galileo, fighting religion. And here's what Bertrand Russell said. So I think it's worthwhile if I read that. Galileo, as everyone knows, was condemned by the Inquisition. He recanted and promised never again to maintain that the earth rotates or revolves. The Inquisition was successful at putting an end to science in Italy, which did not revive there for centuries, but it failed to prevent men of science from adopting the heliocentric theory. That means the sun is the center and everything goes around the sun. Back to Russell, and did considerable damage to the church by its stupidity. Fortunately, there were Protestant countries where the clergy, however anxious to do harm to science, were unable to gain control of the state. So that's the end of his comment. But you see what's going on there, that somehow science was pure and good, and religion was bad, and it was authoritative, and tried to squash any scientific ideas. And of course, he wasn't the only one. Bertrand Russell, George Bernard Shaw, said science education teaches us, quote, Galileo was a martyr, and his persecutors incorrigible ignoramuses. And ultimately, reason finally prevails, according to Shaw, over religion and reached its fulfillment in 18th century Enlightenment. So there's the happy ending. Religion tried to squash things, and scientists fought them, and finally they escaped and set up reason. He says this whole idea, he calls it a tale rather than truth, but it says this tale probably got its start in mid-18th century France, in the Enlightenment in France. There was a book out called L'Encyclopédie, and it took a rationalist approach to religion. I mean, the French thought of religion was just sort of an invention of crafty priests who would go around exploiting the ignorant and superstitious masses. And they warned, they said, Galileo, what happened to him is what happens to anybody who opposes religious bigotry. And it continues today, the same idea. There's a popular science writer, Patrick Moore, and I've read some of his material. He wrote a lot, since passed away, but he wrote a lot on astronomy that I enjoyed reading. But anyway, here's what Moore says. The Roman Catholic Church attacked Galileo because the heliocentric theory was not reconcilable with certain passages of the Bible. As a consequence, poor Galileo spent most of his life in open conflict with the church. So do you see what's going on here? There's this clash. The religion is the entrenched political power, and they're clashing with what they would call liberating forces of science. Let's bring it up even more modern. Here's Carl Sagan. Many felt that Copernicus and Galileo were up to no good and erosive of the social order. Indeed, any challenge from any source to the literal truth of the Bible might have such consequences. We can readily see how science began to make people nervous. Instead of criticizing those who perpetuated the myths, public rancor was directed at those who discredited them. So see what's going on there. Sagan is saying biblical Christian belief is a myth, and it's part of an oppressive social order. And science comes along and it unsettles prejudice. It shakes loose these myths, and it leads eventually to true humanism and social progress. That's the common part of the Galileo story. Bertolt Brecht had a play about the life of Galileo, and guess how he's shown in there? He's a martyr to humanism and reason. And in the play, Galileo says, I believe in humanity, which means to say, I believe in human reason. So that story, Sampson points out, the Galileo story is driven by that myth that there was some kind of opposition, big opposition between religion and science. There's a modern world based on science, but religion is based on the old ways of doing things, and it leads to superstition. It leads to oppression rather than democracy. Okay, he says, well, there's the story, that plucky Galileo comes along with his telescope and using his reason, he stands against the might of the church, and the church works its way with him, and they torture him by the Inquisition. He gets condemned as a heretic. He wastes away in a prison cell, and after that, all Italian science floundered. And Sampson says, well, there's a drawback to this plot. Most of it is untrue. Oh, wow. Okay, so he's popping that balloon. So let's take a look at it. So he said, let's get some background. So you got to learn a little bit of astronomy in the early 17th century, because remember, that's the time of Galileo. So from the late Middle Ages, the model of the universe in Western Europe came from, guess, Aristotle. Okay, so it wasn't the Bible, it was Aristotle. And he reasoned that the heavens, the perfect realm, and the immutable realm, it would be unchangeable in its physical qualities and motions. So he pictured the Earth at the center, and there would be these concentric spheres. The closest sphere from the center, the Earth, would be the moon, and then you get the stars, then you get the planets, that each one has its own sphere. And so there you go. So we got all these concentric spheres, crystalline spheres, and the heavenly bodies are perfectly spherical, and they move in a perfectly circular motion. And the Earth, though, is made of mutable matter, and so it's not as good, basically. Well, around the 2nd century A.D., along comes somebody named Ptolemy, and he constructed an astronomical system that was based on Aristotle's ideas. He thought, okay, that works pretty well with this idea of the sun and the stars revolving around the Earth in their crystal spheres, but there's a problem with the planets. They didn't seem to go in that nice, beautiful, circular manner that Aristotle talked about. They were not doing, they were wandering. In fact, the word planet means wanderer. So he's trying to explain, so what's going on with the planets? So he proposed that the planets themselves moved in smaller circles. I think he called them epicycles. And they were still attached to their sphere. So basically they were going around the Earth, but they were at the same time moving in smaller circles. Well, that was pretty complex. They were, by the early 17th century, so we're getting to the time of Galileo, there are all sorts of problems with Ptolemy's idea trying to work with Aristotelian cosmology. And people are starting to criticize it. There's better observation now. So along comes Copernicus. And he said, based on Pythagoras, it was his hypothesis way back, that it was the sun, not the Earth, was at the center of the universe. But otherwise, Copernicus remained faithful to Aristotle. He kept those circular orbits and some of the other Ptolemaic devices. Now, Galileo was a disciple of Copernicus. He placed the sun at the center. And so otherwise, it looked pretty much like the Aristotelian system. So what the problem is here, well, there's several problems, but one is people think that by putting the Earth at the center, that meant the Earth was big and important, and it was kind of an egotistical thing that people who believed in the Bible would pat themselves on the back, saying, see, we're at the center, we're more important. But this is really key to remember. Aristotle put the Earth in the center, not because it was wonderful, but because it was below the heavens. It was poor. It was not a compliment to Earth. The elements above were finer. The Earth was inferior. So the center is not the highest place to be. It's actually the lowest place in the universe, not the most important. So think of it this way. The Copernican system comes along. It doesn't demote man. It destroyed Aristotle's vision of the Earth as a kind of a cosmic sink, and it actually elevated humanity a little more. So it elevates humanity to the status of almost like heavenly creatures. So the official story that was out there that the Copernican revolution demoted man from the center of things and somehow undermined Christian theology, that's not really what happened. It actually elevated people to be the creator, the sustainer of the world. They're, in a sense, taking the place of God. So let's get to Galileo, what was going on with him. Pretty much, he didn't invent the telescope, by the way. He used it, and he wasn't even the first one to look at the sky. But his major contributions to astronomy were before 1613. He observed sunspots. He saw the moon had irregularities. He saw the phases of Venus. He saw the moons of Jupiter. Now, notice none of that would prove that the Earth moved around the sun, and it didn't. Nobody else in this time period could use telescopes or look out there in space and figure that out. But here's the problem. Galileo's observations conflicted with Aristotle's ideas. Remember, Aristotle said everything was perfect up there. Everything went around in perfect circles. All the planets and the stars and the sun, everything was perfect. But it looks like a lack of perfection up there. The sun had spots, and the moon had blemishes. And so Galileo started thinking about, wait a minute, should I come out with this stuff here? Because the church had a lot of diehard Aristotelians in the universities. And so the church actually went along with Galileo pretty well. There was those diehard Aristotelians in the universities, many of them not connected with the church, who clashed with Galileo. Now, none of these findings proved that the Earth orbits the sun. During his lifetime, they just didn't have enough evidence to show that the Earth revolved. So Galileo comes along. He doesn't publish much at first about those Copernican opinions for a long time. He was 50 when he finally did publish this, and he was approaching 70 at the time of his trial. Now, Copernicus as well had been kind of shy about publishing this. Now, of course, people who don't like Christianity are saying, well, sure, they didn't want to publish this stuff. They're afraid the church would come after them and kill them or put them in jail or ridicule them. But they said it wasn't fear of the Inquisition. Both of them feared bringing it out because they're afraid they'd look stupid. And sure enough, the Aristotelian astronomers did ridicule it. So they were afraid of looking dumb. It wasn't because they were afraid of the church. But finally, from 1613, Galileo asserted the Earth moved around the sun. And he started writing about it in Italian rather than the Latin of the universities. He became a bestseller because of it. But academic colleagues of his said, whoa, wait a minute, Galileo out there is opposing Aristotle. He's not opposing the Bible, by the way. So there's no attack on the Bible. It was opposition to Aristotle that riled a lot of people. In fact, Galileo had good relations with the church, had cordial relations with it. He was actually honored by cardinals. He was received by the Pope. He was befriended by the future Pope Urban VIII. Actually, that Pope in 1620 wrote an ode in his honor. So a lot of the church intellectuals were on the side of Galileo. And where was the opposition coming from? The university people, the secular people. They were the ones who opposed him. So some people say today, well, the church's response, that they opposed Galileo is a fear of discussion and debate. But that's not so. They were quite happy to discuss different kind of hypotheses. Here's another problem that came up, though. Galileo alienated his friend, Pope Urban VIII. So in 1632, Galileo put out something called Dialogue Concerning the Chief World Systems, and it was a form of a debate. Okay, seems like that's harmless. So you have somebody who is heliocentric and somebody who is Earth-centric. And the catch was he has a character who's obviously the Pope, and he calls him Simplicio, which really means simpleton. And so here's, you don't agree with me, then you're a simpleton. Well, that wasn't a wise move. And even Galileo himself said the major cause of his troubles was that he'd made fun of his holiness rather than the idea of the earth moving. So that dialogue got confiscated. Galileo was ill. He was elderly by this time. He was summoned to Rome. Well, did he stay in dank prison cells? Was he tortured? No. He wasn't even imprisoned for several months, or he wasn't treated with remorseless severity. He was detained, and he was told to abjure, get rid of this heliocentric idea. But he was given his own room and servants, actually rooms and servants. He didn't die a broken, lonely man in exile. He got to return to his own home, had pensions from the church. Now, he couldn't travel freely, but he could write and receive visitors. Somebody said Galileo suffered an honorable detention and a mild reproof before dying peacefully in his bed. So it says the judgment against Galileo made people a little more cautious in that debate over Copernicus, but it's really a huge overstatement to say that this put an end to science in Italy. Italy continued, like it does today, to produce many eminent scholars. Galileo scholar Maurice Finocchiaro takes it for granted that the events of 1633 involve what he calls complex intrigues of politics and patronage. It was not, he says, about dogmatic reservations of the church about biblical teaching. Galileo's condemnation was just at a tough time. There's that complex interplay of politics and political ambitions and wounded pride. And Galileo, he was a court favorite, and a lot of people wanted to pull him down. But that's not the story we hear today. Today it's a conflict between his science and the teaching of the Bible. It definitely was not. So it just kind of a summary here as we wrap this up. Aristotle, not the Bible, taught explicitly that everything moves around the earth. Okay, so I think that's really good to know. The Roman Catholic Church upheld the traditional Aristotle's authority until they could get some observational evidence. And then they revised it, and they were happy to do that. Galileo was condemned not because the Bible conflicted with observation. That was not it. They didn't have the observation. Nobody really knew. These were, in a sense, philosophical reasonings. And Galileo's philosophy was butting up against Aristotle's philosophy. He differed with the church over what authority should be used to interpret it. And so his authority was, in a sense, not Aristotle, and the church had landed on Aristotle, as did a lot of people during that time period. So I hope that makes it clear. I like the book a lot, 6 Modern Myths. I have talked about it before. One is the one I just did on Galileo. Another one's on Darwin. Third one's on the environment. I did one on the missionaries. There's a chapter on the human body. Are Christians repressive about the human body? So we'll do, I did one about, what was the other one I did? On witchcraft. Yeah. So if you like, of course, you can go back and take a look at some of my previous podcasts. You might find them interesting on this book. So just because we're hearing these stories today, let's remember, especially when it involves Christianity, that there are people out there that would like to make it look bad and to put it in the worst light possible and actually to make up some things. And so the Galileo story is not Galileo representing science versus Christianity that represented superstition. Nobody knew what the situation was when it came to the Earth's position. Galileo happened to go against a philosophical belief that a whole lot of people had at that time, the Aristotelian view, and he paid the price for that, but not the kind of price that they would like us to believe today. Well, thanks for being part of the podcast, and take care. Hope you're having a good day.